here is the engine and gearbox out of the 1967 Duetto project. I removed it a few months ago, mostly to get at the clutch, but there have been a bunch of jobs all around this engine that meant pulling it out of the car just made sense. Since removing the engine, I have given it a good scrub with some degreaser, changed the rear main oil seal, drained the oil and removed the carburetors, but the footage for that was sadly lost, so you'll have to take my word on it. I've also changed the cam cover gasket, as these early type 1600 cam covers without bolts on the front are prone to leaking, but there's still plenty to keep me busy for this episode. I bounced around from task to task while doing this work. There were certain things that couldn't be done with the engine on the stand, so I switched back and forth between engine and gearbox. I'll show you the work in the order that I did it, to avoid confusion and people in the comments pointing out inconsistencies. So let's get into it. This car has sat for a long time, and the owner wants it to run reliably again, so he can enjoy it without worrying. The bad clutch made that pretty much impossible, but there are all sorts of little systems around the engine that need attention too. The fuel system needs some work and new parts. It has cracked carb mounts, and the old mechanical fuel pump was bypassed, so I imagine that needs replacing too. These rubber carburetor mounts are not old, but they are of poor quality. They have started splitting along the top and causing a massive vacuum leak, so the inlet manifold needs to be removed. But before that, I also need to remove this old one-way valve for the brake booster vacuum line, and the thermostat bypass hose. I'm using a higher quality set of rubber mounts from Classic Alpha that includes a double mount that links the two carburetors between cylinders 2 and 3. I know that the quality of modern rubber just isn't comparable to the rubber from the 1960s, but hopefully this set will last a decade before they need changing again. There seems to be a lot of debate in the Alpha 105 community about whether rubber mounts or solid mounts are a better option. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think when working with an engine that hasn't been totally balanced with a high degree of accuracy, it's better to use the rubber option to limit vibration transfer into the carburetors. But I do know, if you go with rubber, buy the most expensive mounts you can find, and make sure that the carburetor support bracket is in good shape too. I removed the old vacuum valve so I could replace it with this new one. This car was fitted with a brake booster by the dealer in 1967, just like the previous Duetto that I had on the channel. I actually think it was done by the same dealer, given that these two cars were so close together on their VIN number, just 2 numbers apart. I've been told that the brakes on this car weren't that great, so I'm going to go through the whole system, but that will all be pointless without a working vacuum valve. This fuel pump had been bypassed, and an electrical pump fitted instead. I personally don't like adding electrical fuel pumps to Alpha 105s. They don't suit the character of the car, and the extra plumbing and wiring and blanked off pump looks untidy. In my experience, these mechanical pumps are pretty dependable, and I don't see any added reliability by using an electric pump. So I have a new mechanical pump here ready to go. Before I bolt this up, I want to check that the push rods that connect the pump to the cam on the oil pump are there and working. If I turn the engine over and speed up the footage, you can see this push rod moving back and forth ever so slightly. So everything's there and good to go. I just need to make sure the oil feed hole is clear and add some grease to the new pump and install it. I have a full new set of coolant hoses going into this car, but I'll fit this thermostat bypass hose now. Now let's leave the engine work here for a bit and move on to the clutch. Here is the pressure plate that this car limped in with. It's been opened up and put back together with nuts and bolts from the hardware store. As a result, when you put your foot on the clutch pedal, these bolts hit the inside of the bell housing. I'm replacing it with a good second-hand unit that I have in my spares collection. The friction plate came from the same company that did the rebuild on the pressure plate. It's been relined and I don't trust it at all. If the quality of the work from the pressure plate is any indication, it's not going to last. So I'll be using a new friction plate from Classic Alpha. This pressure plate setup is not finished yet, but I need to move on to the rest of the clutch assembly before I can set that up in its final state. The linkage that connects the clutch pedal to the pressure plate needs a lot of work. In the intro video to this project, I showed how the pivoting arm that transfers movement from the pedal to the cable had a piece of garden hose for a bushing. That was bad, but the reality is that almost every part of the system had quite bad wear. This system is often neglected when cars are restored or receive maintenance. Many shops will focus on engine tuning, or when they do rebuild a gearbox, they'll get the synchro mesh right and then totally overlook this stuff. And I think it's really important. There's no point in having fresh synchro rings if you can't fully disengage the clutch. I'm going to replace that garden hose with a brass bush with a steel inner sleeve. This is an upgrade in pedal feel and reliability over the factory rubber bushing. Sometimes I suspect that this right-hand drive mechanical clutch system was designed rather last minute. It seems very problem-prone, and it's certainly not as well thought out as the left-hand drive version. So it's best to keep the system in top condition. This hole for the cable is worn slightly oval, so I'm going to drill it out and use a slightly oversized pin, and I'll have to drill out the corresponding hole in the new clutch cable. I'm replacing the pushrod from the pedal because the old one is bent and very worn, and the holes are badly oversized now, and I happen to have a nice refurbished one in my spares. I'm going to replace the clutch lever in the bell housing. I have this refurbished lever that I've had welded and re-drilled. Here you can see the score marks from those bolts on the pressure plate making contact while the engine was running. The hole where the pin connecting the cable to this lever often ends up worn and oval over decades of use. See how loose the pin is in this lever compared with the replacement part. All this wear and slack over these various parts adds up to a lot of slop in the final assembly. And like I said, this right-hand drive system didn't have much room for error to start with. So it's important to minimize any wear if you want a clutch that's a pleasure to use. This new lever does need some replacement bushings before I can refit it. These aren't brand new, but they are in good condition. And with that, I'm ready to put the gearbox back on the engine and test that all this lines up. But I can't do that with the engine on the stand. And before I remove the engine from the stand, I want to refit the carburetors. I pulled these carburetors apart to clean them out and give them a good once over. Luckily, they're pretty clean inside. I just needed to adjust the throttle linkage lever, which was bent. Then I can reassemble the jets and put the top covers back, and fit the lower half of the airbox. This little strap is the earth for the carburetors. With rubber mounts, it's important to make sure the carburetors aren't electrically insulated, because a jumping spark can very easily cause a carburetor fire. Now I can remove the engine from the stand and test fit the gearbox. Alfa was very thoughtful in the way they designed the 105 engine and gearbox to stand on its nose like this. It makes adjusting the clutch very easy. So thank you, Alfa. Once the gearbox is on, I can see how much travel I have on the clutch release lever. Unfortunately, I don't have nearly enough travel here. This lever should be much further forward. As it is, when the clutch pedal is depressed, there will be almost no pressure applied to the clutch by the time the lever hits the back of the bell housing. This release bearing face on the pressure plate needs to be adjusted. It can be raised or lowered. This is fairly straightforward on a mechanical clutch pressure plate. Remember the bolts that were cut off on the original old pressure plate? Those are not just for holding the spring pack together, but also for adjusting the preload on the release bearing surface. I'm going to tighten up the nuts on it, and that will raise the release bearing surface. I'm putting the gearbox back on to check if I've made enough of an adjustment. There is now plenty of space for the lever to travel and fully disengage the clutch. I'm very happy with this. Now I just need to make sure that the adjustment is consistent at all three of the bolts. By putting a straight edge across the release bearing face and measuring down to the edge of the flywheel, I can detect if any of the adjustment points are higher or lower than the others. It takes a while to get them all even, but when I'm happy that the face is dead level, I can then set the nuts for good. It's very important that this is all level, or else you'll feel a shudder through the clutch pedal while shifting. Always check this before reinstalling the engine and gearbox in an Alfa with a cable clutch. I have, in the past, gotten as far as having the engine and gearbox back in completely bolted up with all the hoses and the wiring and the exhaust, only to discover that the pressure plate needed adjustment, and it's very difficult to do in place. Now the gearbox can go back on for good. And while it's up like this, I'm going to swap out the prop shaft nuts for a fresh set of lock nuts. I have one last job for this episode. This engine needed a new set of engine mounts, but also it needs a modification to the carburetor brace, which bolts up to the engine mount on the carburetor side of the engine. The one that was on here was too short, and I suspect that it's part of why the carb mounts failed so quickly. This is a 1750cc engine, and I suspect this mount is from the original 1600. I'm going to graft in an extension to make up for the added height of a 1750, so the weight of the carburetors is properly supported and the new mounts are unstressed. And with that done, I can reinstall the starter motor and the top of the airbox, and that's it. This engine and gearbox is ready to go back in the car. That will have to wait for another episode, as there are still a couple jobs left in the engine bay that will need doing before I can put the engine back. So I'll leave it here for this episode and let you go. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Before I end off, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who supports me over on Patreon. And a welcome to the new patrons, John Rushby and Andrew Delves. Thanks again, I really appreciate the support.